Why does the financial system look most convincing right before it fails? I've asked myself that question for most of my career, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a way of making sense of what I've seen up close. Stability has a texture to it. It feels orderly, predictable. Markets open on time. Prices move within familiar ranges. Central banks speak in measured tones. And when nothing appears broken, people assume nothing can break. I used to accept that assumption. Early on, I believed that the sophistication of modern finance was itself a form of protection, that layers of regulation, complexity, and coordination made collapse less likely, not more. I trusted the architecture. I trusted the expertise. I trusted the idea that if something truly dangerous were developing, someone would see it and step in. What I didn't yet understand was how much of that stability was psychological. The first real crack in that belief didn't come from a headline or a market crash. It came quietly during a closed door discussion where the conversation wasn't about growth or opportunity, but about failure. The kind of failure that doesn't fit neatly into quarterly reports. We were talking about trust, not in an abstract sense, but as a functional requirement. What happens when trust itself becomes uncertain? The room was calm, everyone was composed. That's what made it unsettling. There was no panic, no raised voices, just a collective awareness that once confidence begins to erode, systems behave in ways that can't be modeled in advance. That was the moment I realized something that would shape everything I did afterward. Stability is not the absence of risk, it's often the accumulation of it. The global financial system doesn't usually collapse because people are afraid. It collapses because they're comfortable. Because long periods without disruption encourage the belief that the system has matured beyond its weaknesses. Volatility is seen as danger, calm is seen as health, but calm can be engineered. And when it is, it often hides stresses that don't disappear just because they're not visible. Money plays a central role in this illusion. We treat it as something solid, measurable, reliable, but money isn't value. It's trust, a shared agreement that what's accepted today will be accepted tomorrow under similar terms. As long as that agreement holds, everything else works. Prices convey information, credit flows, markets clear. But when trust begins to wobble, those mechanisms don't degrade gradually, they change character. I've spent years studying financial crises across different countries and eras, and the pattern is remarkably consistent. Right before a breakdown, the language of stability becomes louder. Officials emphasize resilience, analysts talk about strong fundamentals, institutions point to safeguards and backstops. It's not usually deception, it's reassurance offered sincerely. But reassurance is not the same as resilience. One evening after a long day of meetings, I walked through a financial district that looked exactly as it should: lights on, traffic moving, screens glowing. Everything appeared orderly, functional, alive. And yet, I couldn't shake the awareness of how interconnected it all was, how dependent it was on assumptions no one actively questioned. When systems become that tightly coupled, they don't fail slowly. They hold together until they don't. That's the paradox of modern finance. The tools designed to create stability often increase fragility. Central banks suppress volatility, provide liquidity smooth cycles. From the outside, it looks like control. From the inside, it feels like time being borrowed. But borrowed time doesn't erase risk. It concentrates it, it pushes it forward. And when it finally surfaces, the adjustment tends to be abrupt. There's a quiet confidence embedded in the belief that we've learned enough from history to avoid repeating it. The confidence doesn't come from ignorance, it comes from experience layered with success. And that combination can be blinding. History doesn't punish a lack of intelligence, it punishes certainty. The earliest signs of systemic stress are rarely dramatic, they show up at the margins. In funding markets that become slightly less liquid, in counterparties asking more questions than usual, in correlations behaving oddly. These are easy to dismiss because they don't disrupt daily life until suddenly they do. Seeing these patterns early comes with a cost. There's a kind of isolation in questioning stability while everyone else enjoys it. You learn to speak carefully, to avoid urgency, to choose clarity over alarm, because fear doesn't improve judgment. And judgment is the only real advantage we ever have. False stability rewards complacency, at least temporarily. It makes preparation look unnecessary, even foolish. Why hedge against something that hasn't happened in years? Why question a system that appears to be working? Those questions sound reasonable right up until the moment they aren't. What experience teaches you is that stability is not a permanent condition, it's a phase, a moment between adjustments. And the longer it lasts, the more forceful the adjustment tends to be. not because anyone planned it that way, but because suppressed risk doesn't disappear, it accumulates. I'm not saying this to provoke fear. Fear narrows perspective. What matters is awareness, the ability to look at calm conditions and ask not whether they feel good, but what they depend on, to recognize that the absence of stress is not the same as strength, and that the most important risks are often the ones that feel least urgent. I learned this the hard way by being close enough to see how quickly assumptions unravel when confidence falters. By watching capable, experienced people realize that the tools they relied on only worked under conditions that no longer existed. That experience changes how you interpret calm. If there's one idea I want you to hold on to as we continue, it's this: stability is not proof of safety. It's often a signal to look more closely because the financial system almost always looks most reliable right before it reminds us how fragile it really is. There's a moment that tends to change how you see the system forever. It doesn't come with flashing lights or breaking news banners. It arrives quietly, often in a room. Most people will never enter during a conversation that isn't meant to reassure anyone. I remember one of those moments vividly because it stripped away any remaining illusion I had that stability was something solid rather than something conditional. I was invited to participate in a financial war game, the kind designed for policymakers and strategists rather than investors. The objective wasn't to predict markets or debate policy preferences. It was to explore failure, not a recession, not a correction, but a scenario where the financial system itself began to lose coherence. The room was deliberately simple: no windows, phones left outside, long tables, neutral lighting, an atmosphere that discouraged drama. At first, everything unfolded exactly as expected. A shock was introduced, markets reacted, central banks responded, liquidity was added, the models behaved. It felt almost reassuring, like watching a well rehearsed play. Each participant knew their role. Each response fit neatly into established frameworks. The system bent, but it didn't break. Then someone asked a question that didn't fit into the script. What happens if trust doesn't return? Not what happens if volatility increases or if asset prices fall further. What happens if counterparties begin to doubt settlement itself? If they start to question whether obligations will be honored on time, in full, and without conditions? The room didn't panic. It went quiet because everyone understood that this wasn't a variable we were accustomed to managing. From that point on, the exercise changed character. Liquidity, which had been treated as something that could always be summoned, began to behave differently. Funding channels narrowed, market depth thinned, prices stopped conveying information and started reflecting uncertainty. Not fear yet, just hesitation. And hesitation in a tightly coupled system is often more destabilizing than outright panic. I watched as seasoned professionals, people who had spent decades navigating crises, began to recognize the limits of their tools. This wasn't a failure of intelligence or preparation. It was a confrontation with something more fundamental: the realization that the system functions not because it is robust in every dimension, but because confidence holds it together day after day. What struck me most was how familiar the dynamic felt. I had seen versions of it before in real world crises. In 1998, when long term capital management collapsed, the most sophisticated models in finance failed simultaneously because they were all built on the same assumptions. In 2008, banks didn't stop lending because they lacked capital in the moment. They stopped because they no longer trusted each other's balance sheets. Once that trust was gone, the plumbing seized almost overnight. In both cases, the warning signs were visible in hindsight: excess leverage, over reliance on short term funding, hidden correlations. But during the calm that preceded them, those same signs were rationalized, explained away, treated as manageable because they had been manageable before. Stability created confidence, and confidence dulled caution. The war game made one thing painfully clear: the system doesn't collapse all at once. It fragments, it stops behaving like a single integrated structure and starts breaking into isolated pieces. Markets don't close immediately, they become unreliable. Prices don't disappear, they lose meaning. Liquidity doesn't vanish everywhere at the same time. It retreats, leaving pockets of activity surrounded by uncertainty. When we tried to apply familiar solutions, their limitations became obvious. Emergency facilities assumed participation, coordination assumed cooperation, liquidity assumed willingness to transact. All of these tools worked only if the underlying trust remained intact. Once trust was questioned, the effectiveness of intervention diminished rapidly. That's when I fully understood the nature of false stability. It's not that the system is secretly strong, it's that it's temporarily coherent, held together by habits, expectations, and the assumption that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to matter. When that assumption weakens, coherence gives way to fragmentation. After one of those sessions, I stepped outside into a city that looked entirely normal. People were walking home, restaurants were full, screens were glowing with market data that suggested nothing was wrong. The contrast was unsettling. Inside, we had just mapped out how quickly order could degrade. Outside, life carried on as if stability were permanent. There's a strange burden that comes with that awareness. You realize how dependent normal life is on systems most people never think about: clearing mechanisms, settlement processes, credit relationships. These aren't abstractions, they're the invisible scaffolding of daily activity, and they function only as long as trust is continuously renewed. False stability thrives because it feels earned. It's reinforced by long stretches without disruption, by policies that dampen volatility, by narratives that frame calm as progress. Over time, people stop asking what stability depends on and start treating it as a given. One of the more uncomfortable lessons from that war game was how quickly diversification failed. Assets that were supposed to offset each other began to move together. Correlations converged. Risk stopped being something you could isolate and became something systemic. This wasn't a flaw in diversification itself, it was a misunderstanding of when it works. Diversification assumes markets remain functional. In a systemic event, markets are the thing under stress. This is the difference between apparent stability and real resilience. Apparent stability looks smooth, predictable, reassuring. Real resilience is often quieter. It doesn't draw attention to itself during good times. It's built around redundancy, simplicity, and a recognition that not all risks can be modeled or priced. I'm often asked why warnings about systemic risks fail to gain traction. The answer isn't that people don't care, it's that these risks don't announce themselves with timelines or triggers. They don't come with certainty. They require people to act during calm periods without the emotional reinforcement of urgency. That's difficult, especially in a culture trained to respond only when alarms are sounding. But understanding doesn't require alarm, it requires honesty. Honesty about how systems actually behave under stress rather than how we hope they will behave. It requires acknowledging that stability is contingent, not guaranteed, that it rests on trust continuing uninterrupted, and that trust can erode faster than most models allow for. As we move forward, keep this image in mind: a room full of experts, not panicking, not speculating, but quietly recognizing that the system they relied on was far more delicate than it appeared. That recognition doesn't lead to fear, it leads to clarity. And clarity is the foundation for thinking about risk in a way that doesn't depend on false comfort. At a certain point, once you watch this dynamic unfold enough times, you stop being surprised by crises and start being surprised by how convincing stability can feel right up until it vanishes. That's when the focus shifts from events to structure, from what happens to why it happens. And that's where the role of money, trust, and power becomes impossible to ignore. We talk about money as if it were a neutral tool, something mechanical and objective. But money is a social agreement before it is anything else. It's a shared belief that a claim made today will be honored tomorrow. That belief is reinforced by laws, institutions, and habit. As long as it holds, money functions smoothly. The moment it weakens, money doesn't fail politely. It changes its behavior. I've seen this up close in different contexts, and the pattern is always the same. When confidence is high, money is invisible. It moves quietly through systems. It lubricates transactions. It disappears into the background of daily life. But when confidence starts to thin, money becomes the center of attention. People stop asking how much they're earning and start asking whether they'll be paid at all. This is why crises often feel sudden, even when they aren't. The underlying stresses build slowly, but the transition from trust to doubt can be abrupt. There's very little middle ground. Either people accept the system's promises or they begin to question them. And once that questioning starts, it feeds on itself. Central banks are deeply involved in managing this perception. Their job, at least in part, is to maintain confidence. They do this through communication as much as through policy, carefully chosen words, forward guidance, signals meant to reassure markets that someone is in control. In many situations, this works. Confidence returns, volatility subsides, normalcy resumes. But there's a trade-off that doesn't get discussed enough. Each successful intervention reinforces the belief that intervention will always be successful. Over time, markets become conditioned to expect support, risk-taking increases, margins of safety shrink. The system appears calmer, but beneath that calm, fragility grows. I remember a period after a major intervention when markets were remarkably stable, volatility was suppressed, asset prices rose steadily. The prevailing narrative was one of recovery and resilience. And yet, in private conversations, there was an unease, a recognition that the calm felt engineered rather than earned, that we had addressed symptoms without resolving underlying vulnerabilities. This is where power enters the picture. Financial systems are not governed solely by economics. They're shaped by political decisions, geopolitical realities, and institutional priorities. Reserve currencies don't hold their status because of spreadsheets. They hold it because of trust alliances and the perception of stability. When those perceptions change, the math follows. One of the most persistent myths in finance is that markets are purely rational. In reality, they're deeply psychological. Confidence can sustain imbalances for years, doubt can unravel them in weeks. This isn't a flaw, it's the nature of systems built on human behavior. I've often reflected on how much effort goes into sustaining trust and how little goes into planning for its erosion. We build elaborate models to optimize returns under normal conditions, but spend very little time thinking about what happens when normal conditions cease to exist. That imbalance is itself a source of risk. There's a phrase I return to often because it captures this asymmetry so well. Liquidity disappears exactly when you need it most. In calm times, liquidity feels abundant, spreads are tight, markets are deep, but liquidity is not a permanent feature. It's a function of confidence. When participants begin to doubt outcomes, liquidity retreats, not gradually, but decisively. This is why apparent stability can be misleading. It's not that risks aren't present, it's that they're being temporarily ignored. Or worse, they're being priced as if they can be exited at will. That assumption holds until it doesn't. And when it fails, the cost of exit rises sharply. There's also a moral dimension to this that's uncomfortable to acknowledge. Policies that create calm often benefit those closest to the system first. They stabilize asset prices, support institutions, and preserve appearances, but they also entrench dependencies. Over time, the system becomes less tolerant of disruption and more reliant on intervention. Stability becomes something that has to be maintained rather than something that emerges naturally. Living with this awareness changes how you interpret signals. You stop taking calm markets at face value. You pay more attention to structure than sentiment, to incentives rather than headlines. You ask what assumptions are being made implicitly and what would happen if those assumptions were challenged. There's a quiet moment that comes with this shift in perspective, a kind of clarity. You realize that the goal isn't to eliminate risk. That's impossible. The goal is to recognize where risk accumulates when it appears to be absent. To understand that the most dangerous periods are often the least dramatic. I don't share this to undermine confidence or suggest that collapse is inevitable. Systems can function for long periods under strain, people adapt, institutions evolve, but adaptation doesn't erase fragility, it rearranges it. Once you accept that money is trust and that trust is fragile, the feeling of stability takes on a different meaning. It stops being reassuring and starts being informative. It becomes a signal to look more closely, not to relax. This perspective can feel isolating at times. It puts you out of step with narratives built around certainty and control, but it also frees you from the need to believe that every calm period represents progress. You begin to see calm as a condition, not a conclusion, and that understanding sets the stage for the hardest question of all. Not when the next crisis will come, but how people consistently find themselves unprepared for it despite having lived through previous ones. That question isn't about economics, it's about psychology, and it's where the story inevitably leads next. After you spend enough time watching how systems behave under pressure, you begin to notice that the mechanics of failure matter less than the patterns of behavior that precede it. The same mistakes recur not because people forget the details of past crises, but because they forget how those crises felt. Memory fades, confidence returns. And with it comes the quiet conviction that this time we're better prepared. I've seen this cycle repeat across generations. After a crisis, there's a period of humility. Risk is discussed openly. Safeguards are strengthened. Assumptions are questioned. For a while, caution is rewarded. But over time, the emotional memory of fear erodes. The stories remain, but the urgency doesn't. What once felt unacceptable starts to feel manageable. What once looked reckless begins to look efficient. This is not a failure of intelligence. In many ways, it's the opposite. Highly intelligent systems are especially good at explaining away discomfort. They develop language to normalize risk. They build frameworks that turn uncertainty into parameters. And because these frameworks are sophisticated, they inspire confidence that often outlasts its usefulness. One of the most consistent features of crises is that they're preceded by periods of exceptional calm, not just in markets, but in mindset. People stop asking fundamental questions and start optimizing within existing assumptions. Leverage increases quietly, complexity grows, interconnections tighten. Each step feels incremental, justified, even prudent. No single decision appears dangerous on its own. The danger emerges from accumulation. I remember conversations where concerns were raised, not dismissed outright, but deferred. Not yet. Unlikely. Manageable. Each response was reasonable in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern of delay. And delay is often how fragility is built. Risk isn't ignored, it's postponed. There's a powerful social force at work here. Being cautious in a confident environment carries a cost. You underperform, you look conservative, you're told you don't understand the new reality. Over time, that pressure wears people down. They stop resisting, not because they've been convinced, but because the cost of dissent feels too high. False stability feeds on this dynamic. It doesn't silence skepticism, it exhausts it. Markets, like people, anchor themselves to recent experience. Long periods without disruption recalibrate expectations. What once seemed improbable becomes unimaginable. And when something is unimaginable, it's not prepared for. That's why crises are always described as shocks, even when the underlying conditions were visible for years. There's also a tendency to confuse adaptation with immunity. After each crisis, systems evolve, new rules are written, new tools are developed, and there's a belief that these changes have eliminated the old vulnerabilities. In reality, they've often replaced them with new ones. Risk doesn't disappear, it migrates. This migration makes it harder to recognize. The next crisis rarely looks like the last. It comes from a different corner through a different channel. That novelty reinforces the illusion that the system was stable, that the event was unpredictable. But unpredictability is not the same as randomness. Patterns exist, they just don't repeat in obvious ways. I've often thought about how much effort goes into forecasting outcomes and how little goes into understanding behavior. We obsess over scenarios, timelines, triggers, but what drives crises isn't the trigger, it's the collective response to uncertainty. It's how quickly confidence can flip into caution and caution into withdrawal. When that shift happens, it doesn't wait for a consensus, it propagates through networks, through balance sheets, through institutions that are more interconnected than they appear. And once it starts, it accelerates. The same connectivity that creates efficiency in good times creates fragility in bad ones. This is why people are always caught off guard, not because they lacked information, but because they underestimated how fast perception can change. Stability feels continuous right up until it isn't. There's no gradual transition from confidence to collapse. There's a threshold, and once it's crossed, behavior changes first, markets follow. There's a quiet sadness in recognizing this pattern because it means that crises are, in a sense, self inflicted, not deliberately, but collectively, built from reasonable decisions made under the assumption that the future will resemble the past closely enough to justify them. That assumption holds until it doesn't. I've learned to pay attention to moments when confidence feels unquestioned, when skepticism is dismissed as negativity, when caution is framed as a lack of imagination. Those are not signs of health. They're signs of narrative dominance. And narratives are fragile things. The hardest part is accepting that no amount of intelligence, regulation, or coordination can fully eliminate this cycle. Human systems reflect human psychology. Optimism returns faster than memory. Comfort dulls vigilance. And stability, once experienced, becomes expected. This doesn't mean that collapse is inevitable tomorrow. It means that vulnerability is cumulative, that the longer a system goes without being tested, the more surprising the test will feel. And that surprise is what turns stress into crisis. Living with this understanding requires a kind of restraint that runs counter to most incentives. It means resisting the urge to extrapolate calm indefinitely. It means recognizing that progress and fragility can coexist. It means accepting that being prepared often looks like being wrong until it suddenly looks like being early. There's a moment in every cycle when the story changes, when the same facts are interpreted differently. When confidence gives way to doubt, that moment can't be predicted precisely, but it can be respected, and respect changes behavior. As this reflection continues, the question becomes less about why systems fail and more about how individuals navigate that reality without succumbing to fear or complacency. because understanding the cycle is only useful if it leads to a different posture toward risk. One grounded not in prediction, but in preparation. By the time you arrive here, the idea of collapse should no longer feel dramatic. It should feel understandable. That's an important distinction. Drama invites reaction, understanding invites composure. And composure in complex systems is far more valuable than speed or certainty. When people ask me what they should do in the face of systemic risk, I usually pause before answering, not because the question is wrong, but because it's often framed around action rather than posture, around prediction rather than preparation. The instinct is to look for a move, a trade, a signal, but the most meaningful responses to systemic fragility are rarely dramatic. They're structural, quiet, often invisible to others. One of the lessons that stays with me most strongly is that crises don't reward cleverness in the moment, they reward positioning done long before the moment arrives. By the time fear is widespread, options are limited, liquidity is thin, decisions are rushed. That's not the environment where thoughtful choices are made. That environment is the result of earlier choices. Preparation, in this sense, isn't about bracing for impact. It's about reducing dependence on assumptions you don't control. Assumptions about continuous liquidity, about counterparties always performing, about institutions always stepping in. These assumptions work most of the time, but systemic risk lives in the gap between most of the time and always. I've learned to think of resilience less as a strategy and more as a mindset, a willingness to accept that uncertainty is permanent, that stability is conditional, that confidence is not the same as safety. This mindset doesn't require pessimism, it requires humility. There is a common misconception that preparing for systemic risk means expecting disaster. In reality, it means respecting complexity. It means acknowledging that systems built on trust can change character quickly when that trust is questioned, and that once those changes begin, they don't wait for consensus or clarity. If you're just starting out, this perspective can feel counterintuitive. You're taught to optimize, to pursue efficiency, to maximize exposure to what's working. Those approaches make sense in stable environments, but they leave little margin for error when conditions change. And conditions always change. One of the most practical shifts you can make is to think less about outcomes and more about dependencies. Ask yourself what assumptions your decisions rely on. Ask what would happen if those assumptions were wrong, not in a catastrophic sense, but in a practical one. Would you still have flexibility? Would you still have choices? There's also value in simplicity that often gets overlooked. Complex structures can perform beautifully under ideal conditions, but complexity tends to amplify stress when conditions deteriorate. Simplicity, by contrast, may look inefficient during good times, but it often proves more adaptable when systems are strained. That adaptability is a form of quiet strength. Emotionally, this way of thinking requires restraint. It means being comfortable with not participating fully in every upside, with appearing cautious when others are confident, with resisting narratives that promise permanence. That's not easy. It runs against social and financial incentives, but incentives are shaped by the present, not the full arc of history. I felt that tension myself. The pull to believe that this period of calm is different, that interventions have finally solved the problem, that the system has matured past its vulnerabilities. Those beliefs are appealing. They offer closure, but closure is not how complex systems behave. They evolve, they adapt, and they remain fragile in new ways. What helps is reframing success. Instead of asking whether you captured every gain, ask whether you preserved optionality. Instead of focusing on precision, focus on robustness. Instead of relying on forecasts, focus on structures that can endure being wrong. There are moments when the most appropriate response is inaction, not because nothing matters, but because reacting to noise often increases exposure rather than reducing it. Calm observation creates space. Space allows perspective, and perspective is what keeps you from being pulled into false urgency. This doesn't mean disengaging from the world or retreating into pessimism. It means engaging with reality as it is, not as we wish it to be, accepting that calm periods are opportunities, not guarantees, opportunities to simplify, to reflect, to prepare quietly without spectacle. I've come to believe that the greatest advantage in uncertain systems is not information, but temperament, the ability to remain deliberate when others are forced to react. That temperament isn't innate, it's cultivated through experience, reflection, and an honest assessment of what you can and cannot control. As you move forward, the most important thing to remember is that stability is not a fact, It's a feeling, a collective experience sustained by trust, habit, and confidence. Those things are powerful, but they're not permanent. And when they change, they do so faster than most people expect. You don't need to live in fear of that reality. Fear narrows vision. What you need is respect for it, respect for history, for complexity, for the limits of intervention, and for the simple truth that systems designed by humans will always reflect human behavior. If you want to keep thinking with me, the next chapter is waiting. You don't need to predict the crisis. You need to survive it